Okay, all right, guys. So today I thought we would talk a little bit about evaluators as social change agents, because that was kind of what I was left with the conference last week, the AEA conference last week. It was great to see so many new folks who were presenting at the conference, and all the sessions on equity and inclusion. And it seems like a lot of the sessions were about that. So that was really inspiring, but it also, as AEA always does, leaves me with my head hurting and trying to figure out how am I integrating all that. So I thought we would talk a little bit about that and what you guys got out of the conference. And then we'll do a quick check-in and our usual, what's something that you're happy about and a place where you are stuck. So I love Chris's cartoons. The trick is to fill the simple looking hat with magic. It will always be harder than it looks. So yeah, so evaluation is always complex and messy, at least the kind of evaluation that I do working out in communities. I actually had this practicum student years ago. I don't know if I told you guys this story, but at the end of the summer, at the beginning, when my students start in the summer, I always ask them what kind of things they want to work on, what professional development goals they have. Occasionally, during interviews, I usually don't hire this person, but during interviews, I'll get a cocky one that says, well, I don't want to just make coffee and make copies or something, which my interns never do. I always put them immediately to work. But anyway, at the end of the summer, I always ask them, hey, what did you learn? And I had this one intern that, no joke, said, I learned I don't want to be an evaluator. Yeah, because what we do is just a little too messy for her. So here are some of the questions that I kind of left the conference with. Are evaluators objective scientists or subjective change agents? Whose truth matters? Whose voice do we listen to? I think we saw those themes throughout the conference. So here's my bias from the get-go. I'm a community psychologist by training. I believe in social change and systemic change. I think that's the only way we are going to move the needle on social and public health problems if we focus on the actual root causes. I think sometimes we couch it in social determinants of health when what we're really talking about is racism. So that's my bias. So I would tell you that I believe evaluation is always about organizational and social change, that we are never objective observers on the side. And this is a quote that I shared, or something, a thought I shared with the West Michigan Evaluation Association when I spoke to them a few weeks ago about evaluating coalition, that as evaluators, we have the great opportunity to work for social change by partnering with community coalitions. The talk I gave was about working in the communities and community coalitions in particular. And so, yeah, this is typically how I feel my evaluations go. Okay, I have this thing and it's all planned out. It's very logical. And this is usually what it happens, which is why that student had the reaction she had, because she really thought that that evaluation is research, if you will, right? And we can have that whole conversation. Are we on a continuum? Is it a dichotomy? Whatever. But this is my experience. We lay out our scope of work. We lay out all our deliverables. We come up with an evaluation plan and methodology, and then, it happens. So I wanted to tell you very briefly about a project that I had the opportunity to work on a few years ago. So Georgia Appleseed is a nonprofit organization in the Atlanta area. Actually, they're all over the country, but Georgia Appleseed is the one that I have worked with off and on for years. And they have a great process that I love. They identify a social problem. They do research on the social problem. They talk to the folks who are affected by the problem and other stakeholders. They write a white paper about the problem. identify some strategies, and then with key partners, implement the strategy. So they became very concerned about the poor educational outcomes in kids in foster care. At the time when we started the project, we had about 3,500 kids in foster care. Last time I looked, I think we have somewhere between 13,000 and 15,000. So at the time, that 3,500 or whatever we had seemed like a really large number. And so 3 organizations came together, Georgia Appleseed, in partnership with Georgia CASA, which you may be familiar with. CASA, court-appointed special advocates. They're all over the country. So the Georgia outfit came together with Georgia Appleseed and Families First that provide counseling, therapy, group homes for families in the metro Atlanta area. They came together and they decided they wanted to develop a pilot project for kids in foster care to have their education more of a priority, right? Because typically, you know, of course, we're concerned about kids in care. We want them to be safe. We want them to be not harmed, all of that. But what happens many times is their education outcomes just take a backseat to that. So here is the very complicated logic model. And now you may be thinking about Chris Lisey's logic model workshop. So we have the education advocates, right? So that was the part we were most concerned of. But because I'm a community psychologist, I wanted them to be also thinking about outcomes for kids, right? And then community resources and partners and the judicial system and other systems like education that impact the kids. And I don't know if you saw Isaac and Elizabeth's sessions on 3D logic models. If you haven't, go back and look at it. So this was my very poor attempt about including systems into this conversation from the get-go. Of course, we're really pretty much only evaluating this end. But like I said, this was my attempt to take a systems level approach because the advocates can only be so successful. And so they brought in former social workers, school social workers, retired teachers, that kind of thing, and trained them. And the idea was they were going to train this group of people to work with 50 kids in care and work with them one-on-one and their foster parents to elevate educational outcomes. And the idea then, of course, of the pilot then was to possibly scale it up across the entire state. We could not predict the exponential number of kids that would end up in foster care. So kind of here is my visual of kind of our idea, the barriers that were involved. So for kids in DFACS, Child and Family Services, they had multiple placements. A lot of times the DFACS caseworkers really didn't understand the laws related to IEPs or individual educational plans related to kids in care. There was a lack of communication between them, the school, the foster parents. There was a lack of focus on education, and caseworkers were really viewed as pretty unresponsive and apathetic. Then you had this, these systems that we try to talk about in the logic model that are very siloed. They don't communicate, they don't collaborate. Laws related to kids in care are not understood. Student records don't follow the student. And because kids have multiple placements, their records sometimes get lost. And think about this, the kids who have really a lot, more behavioral outcomes or mental health issues, that kind of thing, are harder to place and harder to keep in placement. So they're even more unstable. And a lot of times these kids, just because of the families they come from and the stress they're under, their student records are not complete. Anyway, then you had all sorts of school issues, board policies that are not really helpful. We had, students that were, that schools were refused to register, individual education plans that were either not appropriate or they had expired. Sometimes caseworkers were signing IEPs, which is totally against the law because they're in the state's custody. So the caseworker was not allowed, but sometimes did. Anyway, all sorts of kinds of systems issues. And all of that impinging on this education advocate that was supposed to work with the student and help them have better outcomes. So again, you know, our plan, the reality, right? So we developed the evaluation plan, very complex measurement model. The coordinators wanted to measure like everything under the sun. Yeah, that didn't happen. So what I wanted to do then is like, okay, what would it look like if all of these systems instead supported these education advocates? Because remember, at the time, the idea was to like scale up and then in turn support the child so that children are appropriately placed, they succeed in school, graduate, all those kinds of things. So I had the great pleasure of then debriefing with the head of DFACS, who's now actually the head of DFACS in Los Angeles, and giving him the feedback about what the education advocates had to say about his caseworkers. That was not pleasant. And suffice it to say that by the time the numbers had so increased, it was pretty obvious that scaling up was not going to be the solution. Now, Georgia Appleseed has gone on and taken pieces and parts of this. They now have a pro bono training program for attorneys to represent kids in care, because one of the things that we did find is that kids in care who had an attorney who was advocating for their educational outcomes had better educational outcomes, and that was more of a priority for the judge and for the child. So some of the work has continued, but definitely not in the way that we imagine. So that's my my system story there. So here's some other questions that I was kind of left with for the conference. So if we're not objective scientists, then what do we do with all the scientific tools and training? I just called into Evaluland, you know, they were looking for people to have their post-conference, and this is what I said. Okay, well, I get it, right? I get, you know, we need to be talking about with community members and appreciating people's perspectives and all of that. But what do we do with all the scientific tools and training? What are the implications for our profession? Are we entering a professional identity crisis? Can we be both an evaluator and a change agent? I think we can. But that was the conversation that I thought we might have today. Okay, that was the quick and dirty. That was totally off the top of my head. I have not had time to practice that at all. That was it.
I think you did a good job.
So I don't know what you guys think or what you thought about the conference. So I want to hear from you.
Overall, I thought the conference was very interesting. I think, I think the most part that I found fascinating was the fact that we can basically, we would be able to create our own agenda at the very beginning, but whatever sessions we missed, we could log back into the website and access those session recordings. And I also think that the lightning